What can we learn by reflecting on the life, adventures, and philosophy of Xenophon, who is both a general and a student of Socrates? Why do many modern scholars ignore Xenophon's philosophical works, while ancient and medieval scholars admired them? Did Xenophon's philosophical writings influence Stoic philosophy? Why did the Athenians exile Xenophon? What was Xenophon's relationship with Socrates and Plato? Why did Xenophon write his own version of several Platonic dialogues? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments and let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video, and please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. Xenophon was born around 430 BC in Athens to an aristocratic family. One of his works was a state manager, and he was an excellent horseman. He likely rode between the family estates with his father. Quite likely he also hunted for meat and sport. The Peloponnesian Wars ended around 413 BC. He must have fought in these wars, and his writings do suggest that he had battle experience, as all aristocratic citizens were expected to fight. Was Xenophon a warrior, a historian, or a philosopher? Xenophon is one of the rare ancient authors whose entire corpus of major works have survived, putting him in the company of Plato and St. Augustine, and he was highly regarded among ancient and medieval scholars, although hypercritical modern scholars tend to deprecate him. He was a student of Socrates and wrote several works featuring Socrates, including a fascinating collection of his Stoic-like sayings in the Memorabilia. One ancient historian, Diogenes of Laertius, in his Lives of Eminent Philosophers, prominently mentions Xenophon in his short life of Socrates, and he said that Xenophon declared that Socrates was only interested in ethics. Among those who succeeded Socrates were called Socratics, and the leaders were Plato, Xenophon, and Antisthenes, according to Diogenes. Antisthenes was the first of the Greek Cynic philosophers who influenced Zeno and the later Greek Stoic philosophers. His short biography of Xenophon immediately follows out of Socrates in his book 2, although this may also be due to his desire to dedicate book 3 solely to Plato. Diogenes also lists 4 other philosophers who were influential students of Socrates. The writings of 3 of the 4 exist in fragments, if at all. And the 4th is Aristippus, founder of the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, known as ethical hedonism, which was similar to the Epicurean school that developed later. Perhaps it influenced them. Although the teachings of Aristippus were rejected by the other students of Socrates, you can argue that not only Platonic thought, but also Stoic and Epicurean thought can be traced back to Socrates. Plato may have been the superior philosopher among Socrates' students, but he was not the only philosopher, and he was not the only voice heeded by ancient Greeks. We see another link between Xenophon and the Cynic philosophers, who greatly influenced the Greek Stoic philosophers. According to Diogenes of Laertius and his Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Zeno, the founder of Greek Stoicism, found himself in Athens after being shipwrecked. He heard a bookseller reading aloud the second books of Xenophon's Memorabilia, the sayings of Socrates, and Zeno was so pleased that he asked where such men could be found. At that very moment, Crates, the Cynic philosopher, happened to be walking past. Pointing him out, the bookseller said, "Follow him." From then on, he studied with Crates, proving himself suited for philosophy, though he was bashful about adopting Cynic shamelessness. Crates was a student of the famous Cynic Diogenes of Sinope, who was in turn a student of Antisthenes, a leading student of Socrates. Now, ancient and modern scholars credit Zeno as the father of Stoicism with a capital S. But Zeno was influenced by the warrior culture in which he lived, illustrated by the Iliad, a world where instead of looking forward to retirement, citizens worried whether a hostile invader would defeat and plunder their city-state, execute all military-age men, and enslave the women and children. In this climate, the very concept of a conscientious objector would simply be absurd. Stoics taught that life was cruel and unfair, but we cannot complain, but rather endure our sufferings without bitterness, conquering calamities with virtue. And we argue that Stoic philosophy, with a small s, is the default philosophy of the ancient world, and that Platonic philosophy also reflected the tendencies of a warrior culture. The historian Droppin Waterfield speculates that Xenophon, as a young student in Athens, learned that the gods valued dutifulness towards one's community, hospitality towards strangers, respect for elders and care for parents, kindness towards friends, and reasonable hostility towards enemies, that they would punish criminals and humble the proud. And the cardinal virtues of Greek men were personal integrity, self-restraint, and knowing one's place in society, piety towards one's human and superhuman superiors, or the gods, and shrewdness and courage. Xenophon's Socrates became the model sage for the Stoics. According to Robin Waterfield, Xenophon believed that a truly good person who has earned the epithet good and beautiful, a compound word in Greek, must be self-sufficient, to be free rather than in servile dependence on others for one's livelihood, self-esteem, actions, feelings, and opinions. And many of these moral qualities were found in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and other Greek works such as the Works and Days by Hesiod. Modern scholars view Xenophon as an indispensable ancient historian rather than a philosopher. Unfortunately, the masterful Greek historian Thucydides abruptly ends his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, the last phase of the war mid-sentence and in mid-chapter. So Xenophon begins his history of my times with the words, after these times, picking up where Thucydides left off. So why did Athens lose the Peloponnesian Wars? In chess there's a saying that the winner is he who commits the next to the last mistake. One fatal mistake the Athenian democracy made was when its general won a major naval battle. However, many Athenian sailors drowned in a sudden storm after the battle, and their bodies were never recovered. And the Athenian assembly then executed many of these generals for this outrage. They were enraged because in ancient Greece, souls of bodies not respectfully buried were doomed to wander the earth, eternally barred from Hades. The inexperienced generals replacing them were as timid as they were incompetent. The Spartans caught their triremes unguarded on the beaches. They destroyed the triremes and massacred the Athenian rowers, later forcing the hapless city of Athens to surrender. After the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, Lysander, the victorious Spartan general, set up an oligarchy of 30 tyrants to replace the radical democracy of Athens. Since Xenophon was both an eyewitness to these events and an aristocrat, he was able to provide a detailed account of these intrigues. This period has been compared to the bloody episode of the French Revolution. The 30 Tyrants, led by Critias, a former student of Socrates, started a campaign of terror, executing many of their democratic enemies, and then executing their fellow aristocrats simply so they could seize their property. Civil war erupted and the tyrants were overthrown, but Sparta declined to intervene, unwilling to support this bloody hubris. Xenophon likewise condemned the 30 Tyrants. Robin Waterfield says it best, the brutality of the oligarchs alienated him as thoroughly as the inefficiency of the democracy. Ideologically, he had no home in Athens, and that is why he seized the opportunity for adventure in the East. Now, you cannot understand the Platonic Dialogues if you do not understand the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Many of the major dialogues either reference historical figures in this conflict or offer commentary on the war. Xenophon wrote his own version of the Platonic Dialogues on the trial and execution of Socrates, and also the Symposium, the dinner party with speeches on the nature of love. When we reflected on these two dialogues, we read Xenophon's account first, in part because Stoic philosophy is easier to understand than Platonic philosophy, and perhaps it is more historically accurate. Xenophon assuredly read Plato's dialogues before he wrote his own version. He's not interested in rebutting Plato's dialogues, but rather he simply wants to publish his own perspective on these dialogues. Xenophon and Stoicism emphasize ethics more affirmatively than does Platonism, and Stoicism is more concerned with the question, how can we live a godly life? Many of the students of Socrates were aristocrats who were wary of the radical democracy of Athens, where demagogues often follow the popular opinion of mob rule, and many were admirers of the Spartan system of government. Socrates' reputation was further damaged by the fact that the chief tyrant Critias was a student of Socrates, as was Alcibiades, whom many unfairly blamed for Athens losing the Peloponnesian Wars. And the two dialogues on the Symposium, or dinner or drinking party, in both Plato and Socrates, have Socrates delivering the last speech on love, and the Platonic version of the speech is more memorable. Both symposiums are set in the time preceding the 30 Tyrants, long before the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, since Alcibiades crashes the party in the Platonic version. And the guest list differs in the two dialogues, but both guest lists include both future tyrants and also victims who were executed during the time of the 30 Tyrants. Now, pederasty or men-boy love was part of Greek culture, though many fathers, such as Lycon and Xenophon's Symposium, were protective of their young sons and were not that open to older men flirting with their children. Although Plato's Socrates is more tolerant of pederasty than was Xenophon, He does prefer the divine love of philosophy. When Alcibiades crashes the Symposium dinner party, he proclaims how Socrates many years earlier had rejected his advances. Now Socrates only loved him as a student, teaching him virtue and the divine love of philosophy, which earned the respect of his wayward student. And we will record a video summarizing the Platonic Dialogues on love and pondering the question of homosexuality and pederasty, or men-boy love, in ancient Greece. We became aware of how many in the ancient world respected Xenophon when studying the works of St Justin Martyr. Justin said he did not approve of Stoic teaching, but he didn't say why. Perhaps he was only familiar with the Greek Stoics, who were known for their libertine attitudes, according to Diogenes. Perhaps Justin was not aware of the writings of Epictetus, who preceded Justin by a decade or two. But Justin was impressed by the Stoic writings of Xenophon, retelling the story of how the Greek hero Hercules was asked to choose between the virtues and temptations of Lady Virtue and Lady Vice. And we compared Justin's retelling to the original by Xenophon. How did Xenophon become a student of Socrates? Diogenes of Laertia said that Xenophon was modest and extraordinarily handsome. Socrates met him in a narrow lane, extended his staff, and blocked his path, inquiring where each kind of food was being sold. He was likely testing his courtesy. He then asked, "Where do men become good and honorable?" Xenophon was perplexed, and Socrates said, "Follow me then and learn." From then on, he was a student of Socrates. And we are reminded how Jesus recruited his disciples when he said, "Come follow me." Perhaps this was a common refrain for philosophers in the ancient world. In the ancient world, philosophy was primarily concerned with virtue, or how to live a godly life. Robin Waterfield commented that Xenophon was quick to learn from Socrates the idea of self-sufficiency built on self-discipline, not least because he could readily harmonize his concept of virtue with the Spartan values he was more and more coming to admire. And the younger son of King Darius III, Cyrus the Younger, generally funded the Spartans' efforts to win the Peloponnesian Wars. After the war, after the affair of the 30 Tyrants, and after the death of his father the king, he asked Sparta to supply mercenary troops in his efforts to seize the throne from his brother, now crowned as King Artaxerxes. Xenophon was asked to join this endeavor, but first he asked Socrates for his input. Xenophon remembers that Socrates thought that friendship with Cyrus might be unwise, as the Athenian officials believed that Cyrus wholeheartedly supported the Spartans against the Athenians in the last phase of the Peloponnesian Wars, where Athens was defeated. Socrates advised Xenophon to go to Delphi and consult the god about whether or not he should go. Now instead, Xenophon asked Apollo which of the gods should receive his sacrifices and prayers to ensure that the journey he had in mind would go honorably and well, and to guarantee a safe return after a successfully completed endeavor. And in his response, Apollo named the gods to whom he should sacrifice. Socrates was not pleased that Xenophon changed the question posed to the gods, but did give him his blessing. What was Xenophon's attitude towards seers who sought the blessings of the gods before a battle? It was common practice for a seer to slaughter a sacrificial animal before an important battle to see if the entrails revealed whether the gods would send a good omen. Xenophon, if he received a bad omen before a battle, would order the slaughter of another animal, then another one, until the gods gave him a good omen. Now Xenophon would delay the battle for a day or two if there were repeated bad omens, but he preferred to ask for success in battle rather than timidly ask the gods if he should act. Now in this adventure, the Greeks win the battle, but their patron Cyrus dies. And Cyrus deceived the Greek troops. He did not tell them the real purpose of their endeavor until they were so deep in Persian territory that they could not return to Greece. They marched for months from the west coast of Asia Minor, today's Turkey, to do battle near the desert city of Babylon. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries dominated the battlefield. As the sun set, they thought they were on the winning side. Now, generations later, Alexander the Great would win the key battles when he and his bodyguard charged and spooked the opposing Persian king Darius III, who fled. But in this battle, when Cyrus the Younger and his bodyguards charged his brother King Artaxerxes' contingent, although Artaxerxes was wounded, the wound Cyrus suffered was more serious, and he died on the battlefield, which goes to show you that often history is determined by chance and luck. But Xenophon rises to the occasion and is appointed the overall general. The victorious Greeks were stuck in the middle of Persia, thousands of miles from home with no supplies since their baggage train had been looted. The Persians feared to attack these formidable warriors. They were escorted north by the Persian forces of Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap and former friend of Alcibiades, and they were heading for the Greek colonies on the shores of the Black Sea. One night, the Athenian commander foolishly agreed to attend a Persian banquet with other Greek generals and commanders, plus 200 other troops who were going to buy supplies from the Persians. The Greeks were ambushed. Some were slaughtered immediately, others slaughtered later. The Greeks were despondent, but Xenophon rallied them, reminded them how greatly the Persians feared the Greek hoplite warriors, reminding them how often they defeated the Persians in battle, urging them to elect new generals and commanders to replace those who were lost to treachery, winning the role of the leading general unanimously. Robin Waterfield says it's best. Readers of the Expedition of Cyrus see Xenophon mature in the course of the expedition, as he discovered, with the pleasure that always accompanies the emergency of competence, his native courage and the capacity for command. Not only did he inspire his men, but Xenophon also adapted the typical hoplite battle tactics to the unique challenges posed by a constant retreat, facing foes in mountain passes, as they headed for home. Finally, when they reached a mountain pass from which they spied the Black Sea, they rejoiced, hugging each other, shouting ecstatically, "Thalassa, Thalassa, the sea, the sea." Xenophon also tells us the qualities of a successful leader in his works. We recommend that you read Xenophon's biography of the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, before you read the Anabasis, or the Adventures of the 10,000, where Cyrus the Younger, many generations later, failed to usurp the Persian throne. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides proclaims that the speeches of the great men in his history were either their words recorded by posterity, or the words they ought to have said. Xenophon's biography of Cyrus the Great included many sayings, and most of the sayings reflected Xenophon's Stoic teachings. Xenophon was fond of hunting and horsemanship, as was Xenophon Cyrus the Great. Xenophon viewed Cyrus the Great as the ideal king, and he opined that perhaps Cyrus the Younger would have lived up to these ideals had he survived the battle triumphant. Although Xenophon does include some moral lessons in his Anabasis, many of the leadership lessons he learned when leading the 10,000 out of Persia while fighting the Persian forces are repeated in the many moral sayings in his biography of Cyrus the Great, or the Cyropedia. Robin Waterfield summarizes the moral maxims from many of the works of Xenophon. Successful rulers, in Xenophon's opinion, know how to care for the interests of their subjects rather than subjects themselves. They lead by example with aristocratic self-confidence, showing flexibility and imagination, seeking the common good and safety of their subjects, and strong enough to stand up to aggression and wrongdoing. Such a leader is immediately attractive to his subjects, who respect and honor him and willingly obey him. And he continues, willing obedience is best, but in emergencies, compulsion or emulation or a sense of shame or duty may be necessary. The vertical virtue of obedience is achieved by instilling discipline in subordinates, and the horizontal virtue is being able to work with others. This raises morale, which is key to military success. But deficient leaders lack the determination and strength of moral certainty. They fail to find the proper balance between coercion and the instilling of willing loyalty. They are too swayed by personal motivations. They do not tell men off when they are making mistakes, but buy them off with rash promises that causes division in the army, and they ignore the omens sent by the gods. After his adventures, Xenophon returns to Sparta and retires. And by the end of their adventures, the force of the 10,000 Greeks were whittled down to over 8,000 who survived the travels and travails of their adventures as they traveled along the shores of the Black Sea. The booty and plunder that Xenophon acquired as commander of the Greek forces made him a wealthy man. When they arrived near where they started on the coast of Asia, most of the 10,000 joined the Spartan forces facing the Persian satraps in Ionia. However, Xenophon was exiled by Athens, and his estates had been seized. In the words of Robin Waterfield, the final straw for the Athenians would have been Xenophon's return from Asia with the Spartan king Agelaus and his presence, if not his actual participation, on the Spartan side of the Battle of Coronea in 394 BC, where the Spartans and their allies beat the army of a confederacy that included Athens. In gratitude for his years of service, Sparta granted him the freedom of the city of Sparta and settled him on an ample estate with ample slaves near Scyllus, which is near Olympia in the western Peloponnese. Here he settled down and raised his two sons, Diodorus and Gryllus. Likely his sons participated in the military training all Spartan youths participated in, although he likely ensured that tutors provided them with the liberal education he had received as a young Athenian. His estate at Scyllus was seized after the Thebans defeated the Spartans in 371 BC, freeing the captive Helot serfs and permanently weakening the Spartan state. Diogenes suggests that he moved to Corinth, where he died. As alliances shifted, Athens and Sparta were either allies or enemies. A decade later, in 360 BC, his exile from Athens was revoked, and both his sons served in the Athenian cavalry. After Grellus died, Diogenes tells the story that Xenophon was offering a sacrifice with a garland on his head when the news came of his son's death. On hearing the news, he took the garland off, but when he was told that his son had died nobly in battle, he put it back on again. What did the Greeks learn from the Anabasis of Xenophon? If a Greek mercenary army could fight its way through the heart of the Persian Empire, through the territories of mountain tribes that had formerly decimated the Persian forces, forging their way through to the friendly shores of the Black Sea, this meant that the Persian Empire was weak and ripe for the taking. Soon the Spartan king Agelaus would invade Persia, though he was not successful. But several generations later, King Philip II of Macedon, after defeating and uniting the Greek mainland, planned to invade the Persian Empire before his assassination. But Alexander the Great would realize his father's ambitions, conquering Persia, using the tactics originally employed by Xenophon Cyrus the Great, and also conquering part of the Indian subcontinent, stopped only by the mutiny of his army, who were homesick for Macedonia. It is no coincidence that the Roman historian Arrian would also title his history of these conquests of Alexander the Great, the Anabasis of Alexander. We like to keep in mind when main characters lived and died. We know that Aristotle was a student of Plato, and Aristotle was quite young when Plato was quite mature, and that Plato and Xenophon lived at roughly the same time. We also know that Aristotle was the royal tutor of Alexander the Great, so we can see that Alexander died roughly 70 years after Xenophon, so they were roughly 2 or 3 generations apart. Alexander the Great may have slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, but during the day he assuredly studied Xenophon's Anabasis and Cyropaedia, the biography of Cyrus the Great. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Robin Waterfield composed fresh, readable translations of many Greek and Roman classics. We reflected on Robin Waterfield's book, Xenophon's Retreat, Greek Persia and the End of the Golden Age, to discover additional insights into the life of Xenophon. His bibliography has descriptions of the major sources he used for his book. His footnotes only include references to the works of the ancient sources, but not the modern sources. You need to search through the books of the bibliography for his modern sources. After this video, we will release a video on his additional insights into Xenophon's Anabasis and other events in the history of the Greco-Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Why didn't Plutarch include Xenophon in his lives of eminent Greeks? In one of his lives, he does review the life of King Artaxerxes, the triumphant king of Persia. Plutarch did treasure Xenophon as a source for his other lives, crediting them often. But maybe since Xenophon's major military achievement was surviving a defeat in a 1,000-plus mile retreat, his achievements did not immediately impact Greek history. We also plan videos on the life of King Agesilaus, using his life written by both Xenophon and Plutarch. Now, scholars have noted that Xenophon wasn't the unbiased historian when describing the moral characters of the generals he served under, but he likely would have appreciated a modern Stoic maxim. And the modern moral Stoic maxim that perhaps he would not have agreed with is the after 5 rule. That is, after 5, and on the weekends, the wife is always right, which is fine for modern households, but would not be in line with Athenian norms. But Xenophon would have definitely affirmed the corollary, the before 5 rule, that before 5, the boss is always right. We should always view those around us in the best light possible, rather than thinking the worst of them. We will also review the wars that were fought after Greece recovered somewhat from the wreckage of the Peloponnesian Wars that are described in Xenophon's The History of My Times. These wars weakened the Greeks sufficiently to permit Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great to later conquer all of Greece. Since all our videos on ancient Greek history use many of the same sources, we have a video and book reviews on ancient Greek history. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.